Imagine walking through the busy streets of Boston on a cold day in January 1919. The neighborhood is alive with the sounds of people working, children playing, and the distant hum of the city. Suddenly, there's a loud noise, a rumble like thunder, followed by an ear-splitting crack. Before you can even turn your head, a giant wave of thick, sticky molasses, 25 feet high, is rushing toward you at a terrifying speed. It's not water or mud, it's molasses, and it's coming fast. You might think this sounds like something out of a weird dream, but it was very real. On that day, the streets of Boston were flooded by millions of gallons of molasses, in a disaster that took lives and destroyed everything in its path. Yet, despite the tragedy, many people have never heard of the Great Molasses Flood. Why has this bizarre disaster been forgotten, overshadowed by other events like the sinking of the Titanic? The Great Molasses Flood, also known as the Boston Molasses Disaster, happened on January 15, 1919, in the north end of Boston. A massive steel tank filled with 2.3 million gallons of molasses suddenly burst, sending a wave of syrup flooding the streets. The thick molasses moved quickly, smashing buildings, sweeping people off their feet, and causing untold chaos. In the end, 21 people lost their lives, 150 were injured, and the area was left in ruins. Despite the scale of the disaster, it's often overshadowed by more famous tragedies, like the sinking of the Titanic in 1912. The Titanic's story is one of a luxury ship doomed by human arrogance, while the Molasses Flood was a local disaster that hit a working-class neighborhood. But when you look at the impact and the aftermath, you'll see why the Great Molasses Flood is just as important to remember. To understand how a flood of molasses could even happen, we need to go back to the early 20th century. At the time, molasses was a common product with many uses. It was used to sweeten food, make rum, and importantly, to produce industrial alcohol, which was in high demand during World War I. The Purity Distilling Company, which was part of United States Industrial Alcohol, USIA, needed a way to store large amounts of molasses that were shipped from the Caribbean to Boston. So in 1915, they built a massive storage tank in the North End, a busy, crowded neighborhood mostly home to Italian immigrants. This tank was enormous. It stood 50 feet high and 90 feet wide and could hold up to 2.3 million gallons of molasses. But there was a big problem. The tank was not built well. The steel walls were too thin, and the rivets holding the tank together were not strong enough to handle the pressure from so much molasses. Almost as soon as the tank was filled, it started leaking. Molasses would seep out through the seams, and local residents, who were mostly poor, would collect the leaking syrup in pails to use at home. But instead of fixing the leaks, the company tried to hide them. They painted the tank brown to blend the leaks with the color of the molasses, hoping no one would notice. The company didn't want to spend the money needed to make the tank safe, and they certainly didn't want to stop their operations. The molasses, had to keep flowing, especially with the war effort in full swing. It was a recipe for disaster, literally. The winter of 1918 to 1919 was colder than usual, which caused the molasses in the tank to become thicker and more sluggish. Then, on January 13, just 2 days before the disaster, a shipment of warm molasses arrived and was added to the tank. This new batch of molasses was much warmer than what was already inside the tank, creating a dangerous situation. The mixture of warm and cold molasses created pressure inside the tank that the weak steel walls simply couldn't handle. And yet, no one seemed to realize just how close to disaster they were. The disaster struck at 12:30 p.m. on January 15, 1919. The weak tank finally gave way under the immense pressure. Witnesses later described hearing a sound like a machine gun or a train going off the rails as the tank split open. A massive wave of molasses, 25 feet high and moving at 35 miles per hour, surged through the narrow streets of the North End. It moved with such force that it knocked over buildings, crushed cars, and even pushed a train off its tracks. The molasses wave caught people completely off guard. The streets were filled with workers, children playing, and people going about their daily lives. Some were swept away by the flood, their bodies trapped in the sticky syrup. The molasses was so thick that it was nearly impossible to escape once you were caught in it. Many people drowned in the molasses, unable to breathe as the syrup filled their mouths and noses. Others were crushed by debris carried by the wave, or suffocated as the molasses hardened around them. The scene was horrifying and surreal. Rescue efforts were made even more difficult by the molasses, which made it nearly impossible to move through the streets. Rescuers, including firefighters, police officers, and volunteers, had to wade through waist-deep molasses to reach survivors, and many of them got stuck in the syrup themselves. Horses used to pull fire wagons and ambulances couldn't move through the sticky mess, and some had to be put down on the spot because they were so badly trapped. It was a scene of chaos, destruction, and death, unlike anything Boston had ever seen. The aftermath of the molasses flood was as sticky and complicated as the flood itself. Cleaning up the molasses took weeks. Crews had to use salt water from fireboats and tons of sand to try to wash away the syrup. Even months later, Boston's harbor was still stained brown, and the streets were sticky and smelled like molasses. But the physical mess was only part of the story. There was also the question of who was responsible for this disaster. The people of Boston were outraged. Many of those affected by the flood were poor, working-class immigrants who had already been struggling to make ends meet. Now they had lost family members, homes, and businesses to a disaster that could have been prevented. The public demanded justice, and a group of victims and their families filed a lawsuit against the United States Industrial Alcohol Company. This lawsuit became one of the first major class action cases in American history. The company tried to avoid responsibility by blaming the disaster on sabotage. They claimed that anarchists had blown up the tank as part of a protest against the government. This wasn't as far-fetched as it might sound. The early 20th century was a time of political unrest, and there had been bombings and other attacks by anarchists in the past. But in this case, the sabotage theory didn't hold up. Investigations showed that the real cause of the disaster was the company's negligence. The tank had been poorly designed, poorly constructed, and poorly maintained. The company had cut corners to save money, and it had cost 21 people their lives. In the end, the court ruled against the company, finding them responsible for the disaster. They were ordered to pay nearly $1 million in damages, a huge sum at the time. The ruling was a landmark decision in the fight for corporate accountability. It sent a message to other companies that they couldn't just ignore safety and cut corners without consequences. The disaster also led to changes in building codes and safety regulations. From then on, tanks and other industrial structures had to be built to much higher standards, and inspections became more rigorous. The molasses flood was a turning point in the history of American industry, showing that progress couldn't come at the cost of public safety. When people think of major disasters, the Titanic is often the first that comes to mind. It's a story of a grand ship filled with rich and famous passengers that met a tragic end on its maiden voyage. The Great Molasses Flood, on the other hand, seems almost comical at first glance. A flood of syrup? But when you look at the impact it had on the lives of ordinary people and on American industry, it's clear that this disaster was just as significant as the Titanic, if not more so. The Titanic was a global event, with people around the world mourning the loss of life and marveling at the sinking of the unsinkable ship. The Molasses Flood, by contrast, was a local disaster that affected a working-class neighborhood in Boston. But while the scale was smaller, the consequences were profound. The flood showed the dangers of corporate greed and the importance of safety regulations. It also highlighted the resilience of the people who lived through it and the changes they fought for afterward. So why is the molasses flood often forgotten? Perhaps it's because the idea of a molasses flood seems too strange to take seriously. Or maybe it's because the victims were ordinary people whose stories didn't make the headlines in the same way as those of the Titanic's passengers. But the Great Molasses Flood was a real and devastating event, and it's a story that deserves to be remembered. Now that you've learned about the sticky and tragic tale of the Great Molasses Flood, what do you think? Can you imagine being caught in a flood of molasses, or does it seem too bizarre to believe? Share your thoughts in the comments below.